The driver of the luxury car, the ungrateful son, had barely driven a few miles when he felt a brutal impact. The bull, which had safely left the elderly woman, appeared from nowhere, a force of nature in silent fury. With a powerful and precise charge, it struck the vehicle, flipping it upside down in a metallic crash. The rich man, trapped in the twisted wreckage, felt the icy terror of karmic justice, the very nature he had hoped would eliminate his mother, now exacting its price. The bull, without a sound, observed the scene of chaos for an instant and, as mysteriously as it appeared, vanished into the night's darkness, leaving destiny to play its part. The rich man's world had turned upside down, literally. The bull's brutal impact not only hurled the luxurious sedan into the air, but also crushed it against the asphalt, transforming metal and glass into a twisted trap. A deafening silence followed the crash, broken only by the slow drip of some unknown fluid and the man's own muffled groan. He was trapped. The seatbelt, once a symbol of his safety, now held him suspended, his head hanging, and blood trickling down his temple. The darkness was almost total, punctuated only by dying sparks from the control panel and the faint glow of his cell phone screen, now cracked and flickering erratically. Pain was a dissonant orchestra in his body. His head throbbed, his chest tightened as if a weight crushed him, and his legs were pinned beneath the crumpled dashboard. The acrid smell of gasoline and burnt oil filled the air, a sinister omen that chilled his soul. He tried to move, but every fiber of his being screamed in protest. One arm was twisted at an unnatural angle, and the attempt to reach his cell phone resulted in a sharp pang that made him gasp. Terror, once a distant concept for him, was now a palpable reality, an icy monster squeezing his heart. He, the man who controlled empires, who dictated destinies, was now at the mercy of a twisted piece of metal and the night's darkness. The image of the bull, that silent, imposing monster, flashed through his mind. It was no ordinary animal. It was a force of nature, an unforgiving judge, and then the truth struck him with the force of 1,000 bulls. Justice. The same nature he had hoped would swallow his mother was now devouring him. He had left her to die, her legs swollen and venom coursing through her veins, in a distant pasture. Now he himself was dying, alone, on a deserted road. The irony was cruel, a venom more potent than the snake's. Meanwhile, a few miles away, the elderly woman felt the night's chill bite her wrinkled skin. The bull had gently left her at the side of the main road before disappearing as mysteriously as it had appeared. The pain in her leg was excruciating, a fire climbing through her body, but a strange sense of peace enveloped her. She was alive, and she was no longer alone in the darkness of the pasture. The distant sound of an engine approached, breaking the night's silence. It was an old car, with yellowed headlights and an erratic rumble, but to her it was the melody of hope. The vehicle stopped abruptly a few yards from where she sat, leaning against a fence post. A middle-aged man, wearing a cowboy hat and with a sun-weathered face, hurried out. His eyes widened at the sight of the frail, bloodied figure. "My goodness, are you all right? What happened here?" His voice was rough, but full of genuine concern. The elderly woman, with a superhuman effort, managed to murmur, "A snake. My son. He left me." The words faded into a groan of pain. The man didn't wait for further explanations. He saw the swollen purplish leg and the unmistakable bite mark. Without hesitation, he pulled out his cell phone and dialed emergency services, his voice firm and urgent. "I need an ambulance, fast. An elderly woman was bitten by a snake and abandoned on the main road near the Almeida Farm junction." Back in the overturned car, the rich man heard a faint, distant sound. Sirens, a fleeting hope ignited in his chest, quickly suffocated by pain and reality. He tried to scream, but his voice was a hoarse whisper. The darkness seemed to deepen, and the smell of gasoline grew stronger. He closed his eyes, the image of his mother, her face marked by pain and betrayal, haunting his last conscious moments. Nature, which he had underestimated and disrespected, was exacting its price, and there was no money in the world that could pay for it. The rich man, suspended in the twisted limbo of his luxurious sedan, felt life slipping through his fingers. The pain, once a dissonant orchestra, was now a deafening chorus, each note a scream from his battered body. The smell of gasoline, once a mere premonition, became a dense, suffocating cloud, burning his nostrils, promising an even crueler end. He tried to move his good arm, reaching for his cell phone, his last link to the world he dominated. But his hand wouldn't obey, heavy, inert, as if it were no longer his own. Panic, a wild, icy animal, clawed at his throat, stealing his breath. The dying sparks from the control panel cast dancing shadows, transforming the car's interior into a cave of horrors. He saw his own image reflected in the shattered windshield, a face disfigured by fear and pain, unrecognizable. The man who considered himself invincible, the architect of his own destiny and that of others, was now a broken puppet, hanging by a seatbelt at the mercy of chance. In his feverish mind, the image of the bull resurfaced, no longer as an animal, but as a spectre, a silent and relentless judge. Those eyes, once calm and deep, now seemed to burn with an ancestral fury, the same fury that had turned his world upside down. It wasn't just an accident, it was a sentence. Nature, which he saw as a tool to be exploited, a stage for his whims, was exacting its price, and the price was high. The sirens, once a faint, distant sound, were now approaching, cutting through the night's darkness with increasing urgency. Were they for him? A pang of hope, as tenuous as the dashboard sparks, ignited in his chest. He tried to scream, to force a sound from his dry, scratchy throat, but only a hoarse, inaudible groan escaped. The darkness seemed to embrace him, pulling him into a deep, irreversible sleep. He felt the warmth of gasoline spreading, an invisible yet palpable threat. The fear of combustion, of the final pain, was almost as intense as the pain of his wounds. He closed his eyes, and the last image that haunted him was that of his mother, no longer with a face marked by pain and betrayal, but with a glimmer of peace, of redemption. The irony was a venom more potent than the snake's, corroding his soul. Meanwhile, a few miles away, the elderly woman was being attended to by a team of paramedics. The man in the cowboy hat, her guardian angel in the darkness, watched with relief as they worked quickly and efficiently. The woman's swollen, purplish leg was carefully immobilized, and a dose of anti-venom was administered, combating the poison still coursing through her veins. "She's dehydrated and in shock, but the anti-venom should work quickly," one of the paramedics said, his voice calm and professional. "We're taking her to the nearest hospital. She'll need observation." The elderly woman, her face now a little more relaxed, though still pale, felt relief spread through her body. She looked at the man who saved her, her eyes welling with gratitude. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice weak but laden with emotion. "You saved me." The man smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "It was nothing, ma'am. Thank goodness I happened to pass by." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "You mentioned a son and a snake. What exactly happened?" The elderly woman closed her eyes for an instant, the memory of the betrayal still fresh and painful. He left me there, in the pasture, to die." Her voice broke. But the bull, he brought me." The paramedics exchanged glances, a mixture of confusion and concern. Delirium, they thought. Shock and venom could cause hallucinations. The man in the cowboy hat, however, felt a shiver. He had seen strange things in those lands, and the way the elderly woman spoke of the bull didn't sound like a confused mind. It sounded real. As the stretcher was carefully loaded into the ambulance, the vehicle's radio crackled with a new communication. "Central, we have a call for a serious accident on the main road, about 2 miles from the Almeida Farm junction. Vehicle overturned. Possible fuel leak. We need another unit and the fire department." The paramedic who was about to close the ambulance door paused, his eyes widening slightly. 2 miles from the Almeida junction? That's the same road we just came from. He looked at the man in the cowboy hat, who now had a serious expression on his face. The man just shook his head slowly, as if a piece of the puzzle was falling into place. The elderly woman, already inside the ambulance, heard the words, the mention of the overturned vehicle. A pang of something that wasn't physical pain, but a complex mix of shock, sadness, and a strange sense of justice ran through her body. Her son, the luxury car, the road, the bull, everything connected in a dark and inevitable way. The ambulance departed, its sirens now blending with the distant sound of sirens approaching the accident scene. The night, which began with an act of unspeakable cruelty, was now unfolding into a drama of salvation and retribution, weaving the destinies of mother and son into a tight knot of karma and consequence. The rich man, on the verge of unconsciousness, didn't know that help was on its way, but that it might already be too late for him, and that the same force that saved his mother was now, indirectly, sealing his fate. The sirens, once a distant wail, transformed into a deafening howl, tearing through the night's darkness with a metallic fury. Red and blue lights pulsed in the mist, painting the trees and twisted asphalt with a ghostly glow. The smell of burnt rubber and raw gasoline, once a premonition, was now a suffocating presence, dense and heavy, promising an explosion at any moment. For the rich man, hanging upside down in his luxury sedan, these sounds were a distorted symphony, a call from the outside world struggling to penetrate the fog of his consciousness. He felt the night's chill, the searing pain in his body, and the damp warmth of blood trickling down his face. His heavy eyes tried to open, but the darkness seemed more welcoming, a refuge from the brutal reality. The first to arrive were the firefighters. Their heavy footsteps and urgent voices echoed in the silence that followed the siren's cutoff. "Fuel leak confirmed. Risk of explosion. Top priority, stabilize the vehicle and rescue the victim." The orders were clear, the tension palpable. A powerful headlight swept the car's interior, revealing the inert figure suspended by the seatbelt. The rich man was a tangle of flesh and metal. The dashboard had buckled over him, pinning his legs. The twisted steering wheel pressed against his chest. Each breath was an agonizing effort, a cruel reminder of his fragility. He heard the clang of tools, the grinding of metal, the hurried voices. Were they angels or demons coming for him? In his feverish mind, the image of the bull resurfaced, no longer as a judge, but as a silent executioner. Its deep eyes seemed to watch him, without judgment, only inevitability. As firefighters worked with the precision of surgeons, sawing and bending metal, paramedics assessed the situation. Multiple fractures, head trauma, probable internal bleeding. He's losing a lot of blood. We need to get him out of here, fast. The voice was grave, full of urgency. Time, a concept he had always controlled with golden reins, was now his most relentless enemy. With each cut into the metal, each movement of the hydraulic tool, the car groaned, and the smell of gasoline grew more intense. A spark, a misstep, and everything could turn to ashes. The rich man's life, once so secure and protected by walls of money and power, now depended on the skill and luck of strangers and the absence of a single spark. Far away, in the ambulance speeding down the dark road, The elderly woman felt the anti-venom begin to take effect. The pain in her leg diminished, replaced by a tingling and a sensation of warmth. Her body, once a temple of pain, began to yield to relief. But her mind, her mind was clearer than ever. The words from the radio, "Overturned vehicle, 2 miles from the junction," echoed in her head. She saw her son's face, not the face of the cruel man who abandoned her, but the face of the boy she loved, whom she carried in her womb. A pang of pain, different from the snakebite, squeezed her heart. It was a mother's pain, even a betrayed mother. The bull that saved her. It had taken her to safety and then overturned her son's car. It was no coincidence. It was the hand of destiny, or perhaps the hand of nature itself, acting through an animal. In the ambulance, the paramedic accompanying her noticed the change in her expression. "Are you feeling anything? Has the pain returned?" The elderly woman opened her eyes, which now shone with a complex mix of emotions. "No, my son. The pain in my body is fading, but the pain of the soul, there's no anti-venom for that." She looked into the darkness of the road ahead, as if she could see the drama unfolding a few miles away. Back in the overturned car, the rich man felt a tug, a sharp movement. The metal gave way. A bright light blinded him for an instant. Hands reached for him, firm and urgent. He felt his body being pulled, dragged from the twisted wreckage of his car. The fresh night air, mixed with the smell of smoke and gasoline, filled his lungs. He was out. But at what cost? He was gently laid on the ground, on a stretcher that seemed to float. The lights of headlights and patrol cars danced over him. Voices surrounded him, asking questions he couldn't answer. "Sir, can you hear me? What's your name?" He tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper escaped. His eyes, now open, fixed on the starry sky, a sky indifferent to his misery. As paramedics worked frantically to stabilize him, he felt a prick, a cold liquid coursing through his veins. It was the IV, life returning, but also the awareness of pain, of the reality of his condition. He wasn't dead, but he was broken. And the image of the bull, that majestic and relentless animal, remained in his mind, the personification of a justice he never imagined would reach him. Nature, which he thought he had dominated, had risen to remind him of his place, and the price, he now understood, was much higher than any empire he could build. The chapter of his life of power and impunity had come to an abrupt end, and the next, if there was one, would be written with the colors of pain and regret. The cool night air, once a relief, was now an icy whip against the rich man's exposed skin. Lying on the stretcher, the world spun around him, a blur of flashing lights and hurried voices. Every fiber of his being screamed in protest. The prick of the IV, a cold liquid invading his veins, was a cruel reminder that life, however much he despised it, still clung to him. He wasn't dead, but he was broken. And the brokenness was deeper than shattered bones and torn flesh. It was the brokenness of an entire life of certainties, of impunity, of a power he believed to be absolute. Paramedics worked with the urgency of those dealing with imminent death. They cut his clothes, assessed injuries, applied compresses. "Blood pressure dropping. We need to stabilize him before moving." The grave voice hovered over him, but the words seemed to come from a distant tunnel. His mind, despite the pain and shock, was strangely lucid on one point. The bull, the image of the animal, majestic and relentless, was no longer a feverish hallucination, but an undeniable truth. Those deep eyes, that deliberate movement, the brute force that flipped his car as if it were a toy. It wasn't an accident. It was a sentence. He smelled his own blood mixed with gasoline and smoke. The luxury of his car, now a twisted carcass, was a metal sarcophagus. He, who controlled fortunes and destinies, lay there, an ordinary man, at the mercy of strangers and his own mortality. The irony was a slower poison, but as corrosive as the snakes that bit his mother. He had wished for her death, and now death seemed to flirt with him, a cruel and seductive lover. Meanwhile, a few miles away, the elderly woman's ambulance sped on, its sirens now silent, as if respecting the gravity of events. The woman, calmer, felt the warmth of the antivenom spread, dissipating the physical pain. But the pain of the soul, as she herself had said, had no antidote. She looked out the dark window, the countryside rushing past, and in her mind the image of the bull solidified. It wasn't delirium, it wasn't shock. It was an intervention, a wild yet just justice. The paramedic beside her, a young man with a kind face, tried to distract her. "Are you feeling better? Would you like some water?" The elderly woman just shook her head, her eyes fixed on an invisible point on the horizon. "He's there," she murmured, her voice weak but firm. "My son." The bull found him. The young paramedic exchanged a look with the driver, still in shock, they thought, or perhaps old age. But there was a conviction in that woman's voice that disturbed them. The man in the cowboy hat, who had refused to leave the elderly woman alone and was following the ambulance in his pickup truck, felt a shiver down his spine. He had heard the radio conversation about the accident. He had seen the gleam in the elderly woman's eyes when she spoke of the bull. He knew those lands, their legends and mysteries. That bull was no ordinary animal. It was something older, deeper, a force of nature, or perhaps a guardian. He gripped the steering wheel, a sense of awe and reverence growing in his chest. Back at the accident scene, firefighters finally managed to free the rich man. Carefully, he was transferred to another stretcher, his body fragile and inert. Blood flowed from several cuts, but internal bleeding was the main concern. Severe head trauma, multiple fractures, possible punctured lung. A paramedic listed the injuries, his voice grave. "We need to get him to surgery immediately. He's in critical condition." The ambulance, which had just arrived for the rich man's rescue, turned on its sirens, tearing through the night. The sound was a lament, a cry of urgency that echoed across the fields. The rich man, with semi-open eyes, saw the starry sky spinning above him. He felt the movement, the speed, the race against time. He was being taken to the same hospital his mother was headed to. Destiny, in its cruelty, wove the threads of their lives back together, not for a reunion of love, but for a reckoning. In the first ambulance, the elderly woman heard the sound of sirens approaching and then fading in the opposite direction. She knew, she felt it. It was him, her son, the same blood that ran in her veins, now spilled on the asphalt. A solitary tear trickled down her pale face. It wasn't a tear of joy for revenge, nor of sadness for loss. It was a tear of complexity from a mother who, despite everything, still carried the weight of a distorted love. The paramedic observed her. "Are you crying?" The elderly woman closed her eyes. "It's the pain, my son, the pain that has no antivenom. The pain of seeing a son lost and the pain of seeing nature exact its price." She knew that the chapter of her life of pain and abandonment was closing, but the chapter of her son's life, if he survived, was just beginning to be rewritten, not with the golden ink of power, but with the vivid red of blood and the somber gray of regret. The night, which began with the darkness of betrayal, now ended with the cold light of justice, and the destiny of mother and son, though separated by miles, was irrevocably intertwined. The siren of the ambulance carrying the rich man tore through the night's darkness like a cry of anguish. It was a sound announcing the urgency of life and the proximity of death, echoing across the silent fields. Inside it, the man's body, once a monument to his own vanity, now lay a heap of pain and fragility. Each bump in the road was a torment, each breath an effort. The IV fluid coursed through his veins, keeping him on the brink of consciousness, a limbo between agony and oblivion. His eyes, still half open, caught flashes of the outside world, rushing trees, the flickering moonlight, and, for an instant, the shadow of an immense dark figure that seemed to pursue him. The bull. The bull's image was no longer just a memory, but a palpable presence, a silent executioner accompanying him on his journey to personal hell. He felt the weight of the animal's gaze, the force of its charge, the mute roar of primordial justice. The physical pain was excruciating, but the mental anguish was a more refined torture. He who had always controlled everything was now a mere object, moved, examined, pierced. Impotence was a poison spreading faster than any hemorrhage. He thought of his mother, her swollen leg, the venom. A pang of terror chilled his blood. It wasn't remorse, not yet. It was the primitive fear that the same fate, or worse, awaited him. Nature, which he had defied and tried to subjugate, was exacting its price, and the bull was its relentless collector. Meanwhile, in the first ambulance, the elderly woman felt the physical relief deepen. The tingling in her leg diminished, and the sensation of warmth spread, dissipating numbness and pain. But her mind was far from finding peace. She heard the distant wail of the other siren, a sound that approached and then receded, carrying her son to the same destination. The hospital. A place of healing, but also of reckoning. She closed her eyes, and the image of the bull formed in her mind. It wasn't just any animal, it was a spirit, a guardian, a manifestation of the very earth her son had desecrated. It had bowed to her, the old and fragile woman, and carried her to safety. And then, with a force that defied logic, it had overturned the car of the man who abandoned her. It was the hand of destiny, weaving a complex pattern of retribution. The paramedic beside her, the young man with a kind face, noticed the intensity in her expression. "Are you all right? Do you need anything?" She opened her eyes, which now carried the wisdom of centuries and the pain of a lifetime. "I'm fine, my son. It's just that life has its ways, and justice, sometimes, comes from where we least expect it." She looked out at the dark countryside, imagining the bull, majestic and silent, returning to the shadows from whence it came, its mission accomplished. The man in the cowboy hat, in his pickup truck, kept a respectful distance from the elderly woman's ambulance. He had slowed down to let the other ambulance pass, and the glare of its headlights in his rearview mirror briefly revealed the severity of the accident. He knew the rich man was in trouble, but he also knew there was something more at play. He had seen the bull, the way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes. It was no ordinary animal. It was a living legend, a spirit of the earth that had risen to protect the weak and punish the arrogant. He felt a shiver down his spine, a mixture of awe and reverence. The world, he thought, was much larger and more mysterious than rich men and their luxury cars could comprehend. In the rich man's ambulance, the medical team worked frantically. "We're losing him, blood pressure dropping further." The doctor's voice was grave, laden with urgency. The man felt the cold of death approaching, an icy embrace threatening to take him. But then, a new prick, a new IV, and life clung to him again, dragging him back to consciousness, to pain, to fear. He didn't want to die. Not like this. Not before understanding. Not before. The image of his mother, her swollen leg, the look of betrayal and despair, flooded his mind with brutal clarity. He had left her to die. He, her own son, the bull. The bull was her vengeance. It was nature, the earth, destiny itself, acting on her behalf. The shock of the realization was almost as painful as his injuries. A solitary tear, the first in years, trickled from the corner of his eye. It wasn't a tear of regret, not yet. It was a tear of terror, terror of what awaited him, if he survived. The two ambulances, now at different stages of their journey, converged on the same point, the hospital, An imposing structure of cold lights and sterile corridors awaited. The elderly woman, with a clear mind and a heavy heart, prepared for the inevitable reunion. She knew that justice had been served, but a mother's pain, even a betrayed mother's, was a burden that no justice could fully alleviate. Her son, the rich man, fought for his life, not only against his injuries, but against the crushing truth that finally reached him. The bull had overturned his car, but life in its relentless wisdom had turned his world upside down. The chapter of his impunity had ended, and the next, if he had a chance to write it, would be a saga of pain, reflection, and perhaps redemption. The night, which began with the darkness of betrayal, now ended with the cold light of justice, and the destiny of mother and son, though separated by miles, was irrevocably intertwined, about to collide under the fluorescent lights of a hospital. The silence that followed the receding sirens was more deafening than any sound, foreshadowing the drama to come. The siren of the rich man's ambulance tore through the night air one last time before being abruptly silenced. The rear door opened with a dull thud, revealing urgency and chaos. Stretchers were pulled out, emergency lights flashed at a frantic pace, and hurried voices echoed through the hospital's entrance corridors. Severe trauma, multiple fractures, TBI, internal bleeding. Ooh! The paramedics' shouts mingled with the sound of stretcher wheels rolling across the polished floor. The rich man, once a symbol of power and control, was now an inert burden, a broken body, carried by the medical team like a macabre trophy of the night. His still half-open eyes caught blurs of fluorescent lights and worried faces, but his mind was trapped in a whirlwind of pain and terrifying images. The bull's gaze, the bull's strength. He smelled antiseptics, the cold metal of the stretcher, but everything was overshadowed by the feeling of an overwhelming weight on his chest, not just from his injuries, but from the weight of his actions, as the emergency team rushed to stabilize the rich man. Taking him to surgery, the second ambulance, carrying the elderly woman, arrived more calmly. No sirens, no same feverish urgency. The door opened softly, and the elderly woman was carefully removed. Her injuries were less dramatic, but age and fragility made her equally vulnerable. She watched the frantic movement around her, the flashes of blue and red lights still visible in the corner of her vision. She knew her son was there, somewhere in that labyrinth of corridors and emergency rooms. The pain in her leg had considerably diminished, but the pain in her heart, the pain of a mother who saw her son lost, was a wound that time and medicine could not heal. The man in the cowboy hat, who had followed the elderly woman's ambulance, parked his pickup truck in a more secluded corner of the hospital parking lot. He observed the scene, the arrival of the two ambulances, the rush, the human drama unfolding under the cold lights. He wasn't a relative nor a friend, but felt compelled to stay. He had witnessed something that defied logic, something that belonged to an older, wilder realm. That bull was not just an animal, it was the personification of justice, a spirit of the earth that had risen to correct a wrong. He felt his presence there was a form of reverence, to witness the unfolding of a destiny shaped by forces greater than men. Inside the emergency room, the rich man was being prepared for surgery. Doctors and nurses moved with precision, their voices calm and professional, but the tension was palpable. He felt the needles piercing his skin, the cold air of oxygen on his face, the metallic smell of his own blood. Pain was a constant, but now a new sensation mingled with it. Terror. Not the terror of death, but the terror of truth. The image of his mother, abandoned in the pasture, her legs swollen, her look of despair, projected into his mind with terrifying clarity. And then the bull. The bull was not an accident, it was a judgment. It was the vengeance of the earth, the voice of nature, the hand of destiny. He had been a king in his own world, but now he was a beggar, a broken body, at the mercy of forces he could never comprehend or control. A tear trickled from his eye, not from physical pain, but from an existential terror, from a brutal understanding of his insignificance. Meanwhile, in a quieter observation room, the elderly woman was being examined. The young paramedic with the kind face was by her side, ensuring she was comfortable. "You're stable, Donna Maria. We'll just run some tests to make sure the venom hasn't left any lasting effects." She nodded, her eyes fixed on a distant spot on the wall. She heard the muffled sounds of the hospital, the voices, the beeps of machines. She knew he was near. She felt the presence of her son, the same blood, the same flesh, now separated by walls and by an abyss of pain and betrayal. She felt no joy, no triumph, only a deep sadness, the sadness of watching her son's life crumble. The bull had played its part. Now the rest was up to life, to destiny, to conscience. The man in the cowboy hat outside lit a cigarette, the orange glow illuminating his thoughtful face. He looked at the starry sky, which had witnessed the night of betrayal and the morning of justice. That hospital, with its cold lights and science, was merely a temporary stage. The real drama had unfolded under the open sky, where nature had spoken in its own language, through a giant bull and an unforgiving destiny. He knew that the story of that night wouldn't end there, within the sterile walls of a hospital. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter of reckoning, of redemption, or perhaps of an even greater condemnation. The night's silence, now that the sirens had ceased, seemed to carry the weight of all unspoken truths, of all unhealed pains, and of the inevitable collision of destinies that awaited mother and son inside that building. The constant hum of life support machines was the rich man's new soundtrack. Each beep, each electronic whisper seemed like a countdown to an uncertain fate. Anesthesia, a chemical veil over physical pain, couldn't erase the images projected in his mind. The bull, always the bull. Its eyes, red and deep, were not those of an animal, but of a silent judge, a herald of a truth he had tried to bury under layers of money and arrogance. He felt the surgeon's hands on his body, the coldness of metal, the pressure. But the most vivid sensation was the crushing weight of the bull, not just on his car, but on his soul. With each assisted breath, each weak beat of his heart, the image of his mother in the pasture, her swollen leg, her look of despair, returned with brutal clarity. There was no escape. The darkness of unconsciousness was merely a stage for his worst fears, for the consequences of his cruelty. He had built an empire, believing himself invulnerable, above the laws of men and nature. Now he lay there, a broken body, an empty shell, at the mercy of scalpels and wires, a pathetic reminder of his insignificance. The terror was not of death, but of the life that awaited him, should he survive. A life where his power meant nothing, where his fortune was dust, and where the truth of his actions would be his only legacy. That bull had not just overturned his car, it had turned his world upside down, exposing the rot he had worked so hard to conceal. Meanwhile, in her observation room, Donna Maria was enveloped in a different kind of silence. The young paramedic with the kind face had left, leaving her to her own thoughts. The hospital lights were soft. The air conditioning blew a constant breeze. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was strangely clear. The pain in her leg, once throbbing and unbearable, was now a distant discomfort, a physical reminder of a much greater wound. She looked at the white wall, but saw the green pasture, the strong sun, the shadow of the bull. She felt no fear of the animal, but a deep reverence. It had been her salvation, an instrument of a justice she never dared to hope for, but justice, she realized, brought no joy. Only a deep sadness, a melancholy that weighed on her chest like a stone. Her son was there, just a few walls away, fighting for his life. And she, the mother he tried to abandon, could feel nothing but a searing pain for him. It wasn't the pain of betrayal, which had already been absorbed and transmuted into resignation. It was the pain of watching a son lost, of witnessing his own destruction. The bull had played its part, delivering him to the edge of the abyss. Now the rest was up to him, to his conscience, to the possibility of redemption, or to the inevitable condemnation that would come from within. She closed her eyes, and a single tear trickled down, not for herself, but for the man who was once her boy, and who was now a stranger, broken and lost. The venom in her leg had been neutralized, but the venom in her son's heart, she knew, was far more insidious and perhaps incurable. Inside the hospital, the medical team moved with the silent efficiency of those who deal with life and death daily. For them, it was another case of severe trauma, another rich man in an ICU bed. But for the rich man, every minute was an eternity of torment. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry, his voice a mere hoarse whisper. The words he wanted to utter were a tangle of regret and despair. He saw his mother's face, not as she was now, but as she was in the pasture, her legs swollen, her eyes pleading, betrayal etched into every line of her face. And then the image of the bull, its black deep eyes without judgment, just the brute force of nature which had crushed him under the weight of his own cruelty. He struggled against the tubes and wires, a prisoner in his own body, a prisoner of his own mind. Nurses calmed him, injecting more sedatives, but the peace they sought to impose was superficial. The true battle was taking place within him, where consciousness, finally awakened, waged war against years of selfishness and indifference. Donna Maria, in turn, felt a strange calm. The decision, she realized, had been made long before her son overturned his car. A mother's love, she knew, was a river that ran deep, capable of forgiving the greatest transgressions, but not of erasing scars. She sought no vengeance, not even an apology. She sought her son's soul, the essence of the boy she had raised, who had been lost in a labyrinth of ambition and power. She rose slowly, feeling the weight of her still aching leg, but determined. The time had come. The time to face what remained of her son, not as a judge, but as the mother who, despite everything, still loved him. She knew that his journey to redemption would be long and painful, and that she herself wasn't sure if she could bear the sight of what he had become. But she was a mother, and her son's call, even if it was a silent call of pain and regret, was something she could not refuse. The man in the cowboy hat watched a nurse leave the hospital, light a cigarette and look up at the sky. He knew the drama was about to reach its climax. That hospital, with its glass doors and aseptic corridors, was about to witness a truth older than any science, deeper than any physical wound. The sunlight now fully bathed the horizon, revealing a new day, and with it, the inevitability of an encounter that would forever change the lives of mother and son. The bull had delivered its message, and now humanity had to deal with the consequences. Destiny, relentless and just, had arrived to collect its debts. The hospital's air conditioning blew a constant breeze, but Donna Maria felt a chill that didn't come from the cold. It was apprehension, the quiet before an earthquake. Every step she took, dragging her still aching leg, was an act of will, a journey through a desert of memories and disappointments. The white corridors, once merely sterile paths, now seemed like a tunnel leading her back to the past, to every choice, every mistake that shaped the man she was about to confront. She was no longer the fragile woman abandoned in the pasture. That encounter with the bull, with death and salvation, had forged in her a new resilience. But the newfound strength didn't erase the pain. She felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, not the weight of the injustice she had suffered, but the weight of the tragedy that had befallen her son. He, who was once her boy, now lay broken, not just in body, but in spirit. With each door she passed, each unknown face of nurses and doctors, Donna Maria felt the inevitability of the moment. A mother's love, she knew, was a paradoxical force. It could be the gentlest of caresses and the most relentless of truths. She wasn't going to condemn him, nor to forgive him. She was going to see him, to witness what remained of the son she had loved unconditionally, even when he had become unrecognizable. Meanwhile, in the ICU, the rich man thrashed in a deep, agitated sleep. The sedatives barely contained the storm raging in his mind. Fragmented images collided, the cruel glare of the sun in the pasture, the grotesque swelling in his mother's leg, the smell of earth and blood, and above all, the bull's eyes. Those eyes, once just a detail in the landscape, were now the epicenter of his personal hell. They pursued him, not with anger, but with an indifference that was even more terrifying, an indifference that said, "You are insignificant. Nature doesn't care about your empires, your fortune, your arrogance." He felt the animal's weight, not just on his crushed body, but in every fiber of his soul. The bull had not just overturned his car, it had overturned his life, his identity, his perception of himself. He was a dethroned king, a fallen god, and the fall was more painful than any physical wound. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. He tried to flee, but he was trapped, chained to his own consciousness. The on-duty nurse adjusted the monitors, oblivious to the existential drama unfolding under her watch. To her, he was just another patient, another body to be kept alive. But for the rich man, each monitor beat was a reminder of time slipping away, of time he had wasted in pursuit of empty power. He saw his mother's face, no longer pleading, but serene, almost distant, as if she had abandoned him long before the pasture. And that image, the image of a mother who had moved past him, was the cruelest of all. Donna Maria finally reached the glass door of the ICU. She paused, her hand trembling slightly as she touched the cold metal of the handle. On the other side, through the glass, she saw him, enveloped in tubes and wires, pale, a ghost of the man he had been. Her heart tightened, not with anger, but with an ancient pain, a pain that came from the depths of her soul. It was the pain of watching a son lost, of witnessing his own destruction. She took a deep breath, gathered what remained of her courage, and opened the door. The soft click echoed in the sterile silence of the room. The nurse turned, surprised, but a gentle nod from Donna Maria calmed her. She approached the bed, each step an eternity. Her son's face was contorted in an expression of torment, even under the effect of sedatives. He seemed to be fighting against something invisible, something only he could see. Donna Maria reached out, hesitant, and touched his feverish forehead. His skin was damp, cold. There was no response, no recognition. Only the constant sound of the monitors, the assisted breathing, the whisper of life hanging by a thread. She looked at him, at the man who tried to kill her, and felt a wave of sadness so profound it seemed to crush her. The bull had overturned the car, had delivered nature's judgment, but redemption, she knew, was a path he would have to walk alone. And she, his mother, would be there, not to guide, but to bear witness, to offer a silent presence in his abyss. Outside, the man in the cowboy hat watched the sun rise higher in the sky. He knew that the reckoning was not just physical, but spiritual. Nature had played its part, bringing down the arrogant. Now humanity, in its complexity of love and forgiveness, hatred and regret, would have to find its own way. He saw the nurse leave the ICU with a thoughtful look. That room now was a sanctuary of pain and perhaps, just perhaps, of a new chance. The bull had roared, and the echo of that roar would reverberate for a long time, reminding everyone that there are forces greater than any empire, and that justice sometimes comes on hooves and horns. Destiny had arrived, and with it, the promise that not all venom was incurable, nor all souls lost forever. But healing, she knew, would not come from outside, but from within, from a place he had long forgotten. The silence of the ICU room was heavy, filled only by the mechanical rhythm of the machines that kept the rich man on the brink of life. Donna Maria remained there, her hand still on her son's forehead, feeling the fever that was not just of the body, but of a soul in turmoil. She observed the subtle contractions on his face, his eyelids trembling like butterfly wings caught in an invisible web. He fought, even in his induced sleep, against the ghosts the bull had unleashed. For her, each tube, each wire, was an extension of the web he himself had woven over the years, a web of ambition and indifference that now trapped him. She didn't see the powerful man he strived to be, but the frightened boy hiding behind the mask of arrogance, the boy who, at some point in life, had lost himself. The pain in her chest was not of anger, but of a deep compassion, the compassion of a mother who sees her son drowning in a sea he himself created. The memories of the pasture, of the swollen leg, of the insidious venom, of her own near death did not fade, but strangely they mingled with the image of the bull, not as an executioner, but as a messenger, an instrument of a greater truth. The bull had not acted out of malice, but out of a primordial instinct for balance. It had broken the cycle of cruelty, not with hatred, but with the brute force of nature that distinguishes neither kings from peasants. Inside the rich man's mind, the storm continued. Sedatives were a fragile dam against the torrent of images and sensations. He was back in the pasture, but this time it wasn't he who observed his mother. It was he who lay on the ground, his legs swollen, venom coursing through his veins. He felt the abandonment, the despair, the cold of the damp earth. And then the shadow. Not his mother's shadow, but the imposing shadow of the bull. Those black, deep eyes now stared at him with an intensity that pierced his soul. There was no anger, no judgment, only the naked, raw truth of his insignificance. He saw his life pass like a distorted film, the piles of money, the imposing buildings, the people he used and discarded. Everything seemed empty, meaningless. The power he had so sought was an illusion, an empty shell. True power, he realized with an icy terror that made him sweat cold, even under the effect of sedatives, was in the simplicity of life, in the connection with the earth he had desecrated, with the people he had hurt, with the mother he had tried to discard. The bull's weight was not just physical, crushing him. It was the weight of all his choices, all his omissions, all his cruelty. It was the weight of nature exacting its price, not with vengeance, but with the relentless scales of balance. Donna Maria removed her hand from her son's forehead, feeling that her presence there was more for her than for him at that moment. He needed to traverse his own hell. She sat in the chair beside the bed, her eyes fixed on his pale, tormented face. The journey of redemption, she knew, was a solitary one. No one could forgive for him. No one could heal the wounds he himself had inflicted on his soul. But she could be there, a silent anchor, a reminder that, despite everything, a love persisted. Outside, the man in the cowboy hat lit another cigarette, the smoke mingling with the fresh morning air. He observed the hospital, a fortress of science and technology, but knew that within it a drama unfolded that transcended medicine. It was the old story of humanity, fighting against its own nature, against the arrogance that distances it from the essential. The bull had been the catalyst, the brute force that shattered the man's illusion of control. Now, the seed of truth had been planted in the rich man's heart, and what would sprout from it was uncertain. The nurse who had left earlier returned, casting a curious glance at Donna Maria's motionless figure beside the bed. She felt the tension in the air, the dense energy emanating from that room. It wasn't just the patient's physical pain, but something deeper, something the monitors couldn't measure. Donna Maria closed her eyes for an instant, feeling the weariness but also a strange clarity. She wasn't there to demand anything, nor to offer easy forgiveness. She was there to bear witness, to witness her son's struggle, so that if he one day awakened to true life, he would know he wasn't completely alone. A mother's love, she thought, was not a contract, but a promise, a flame that even weak could withstand the strongest winds. The artificial respiration machine whispered in the room, and the rich man, in his delirium, began to agitate more intensely, the monitors beeping with an alarming frequency. His struggle was real, and the line between life and death, between madness and consciousness, was thinner than ever. The journey had only just begun. The artificial respiration machine whispered in the room, and the rich man, in his delirium, began to agitate more intensely, the monitors beeping with an alarming frequency. His struggle was real, and the line between life and death, between madness and consciousness, was thinner than ever. The nurse hurried to the bed, checking his vital signs, adjusting the machines. Donna Maria, however, did not move, her eyes fixed on her son's contorted face. She knew that the true battle was not being fought in the monitor's numbers, but in his soul. Suddenly, the rich man's eyes opened. Not completely, but a slit, revealing a blurry, disoriented gleam. He blinked, the room's light seeming like an assault. The murmuring ceased, replaced by a faint, almost inaudible groan. Donna Maria held her breath. The nurse paused, watching. He tried to lift his hand, but weakness prevented him. His eyes, still blurry, moved slowly until they met his mother's wrinkled face. For a long moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the machine's whisper. Then, with an effort that seemed superhuman, a single word emerged from his cracked lips. Not a child's cry, but a hoarse whisper, laden with a pain and regret that transcended the physical. Mother. Donna Maria felt a lump in her throat, but she didn't cry. That mother was different from all the others. It wasn't the desperate cry of a nightmare, but recognition, confession, the first thread of a bridge he might be willing to build. She reached out and gently touched her son's feverish forehead. There was no explicit forgiveness in her touch, but a silent acceptance, a promise that she would be there. The rich man closed his eyes again, but this time the agitation in his body lessened. The monitors returned to a calmer rhythm. The storm in his mind seemed to have found a harbor, however fragile. The nurse sighed, relieved, and began to record her notes. Outside, the man in the cowboy hat extinguished his cigarette in the makeshift ashtray and looked up at the sky. The clouds dissipated, revealing a deep blue. Nature had played its part. The bull had overturned the car, broken the body, and forced the soul to confront itself. Now the journey was only just beginning, no longer in a distant pasture, but in the arid terrain of redemption, with hope finally guiding the way.